I'm Jacob Powell. I spent 11.5 years in federal prison for aggravated bank robbery, a crime I did commit, and during which time I accumulated the entirety of this correspondence and legal writings. In fact, my legal writings were actually about 4 times as much as this. However, due to staff misconduct and retaliation, those documents were destroyed over and over again. Nevertheless, I've saved what I could because today is going to be a very special day. All of this is going to be burned. As you can see, I've been growing my hair very long, 63 months actually, part of a Nazarite vow. That vow ends tomorrow on my 40th birthday, when my head will be shaved and similarly burned. But today, this stuff is getting burned first. So Jones gave us a little preview or a little review of what the Nazarite vow is about. So it's in the book of Numbers, which for those of you who remember your Bible classes is in the Torah or the law of the Jewish people. And so the vow of the Nazarite is something that a Jewish man or woman could take in order to set themselves apart for God. And one of the main things is that you can't cut your hair. So your hair grows very long. And at first, that's not much of a problem, but as it starts getting longer, it starts to become a big pain in the butt. As I'm sure some of you ladies know who have had long hair in the past. Another requirement is that you can't have any grapes or grape products, which includes vinegar. I didn't know this when I started it, but vinegar is in a lot of stuff, and it's in a lot of good stuff. No mayonnaise, no ketchup, no mustard. You can't have anything made from grapes. So no wine, obviously. I'm not supposed to drink wine anyway. No grape juice, and a whole list of other things. So what I've had to do is anything that I've eaten for the last 63 months, I've had to review the ingredients, talk to the person who made it, or had to just go without eating, which didn't really like doing that. I remember when it was about 4 months ago, I went by McDonald's and got me a fish fillet and specifically told them, please do not put any tartar sauce on there. Unfortunately, whenever I went out to the car, I opened it up, there's tartar sauce. And I can't just scrape it off, can't eat it. And I didn't have time to go back in. So that was a day that the Nazarite vow said, hey, you know what? You're not going to eat today. But that's all fine and dandy because it's just part of the process. This is something that I began in 2020. As most of you know, I was imprisoned during that time, and I was at a place called FCI Beaumont. Beaumont is not a very good prison, if that's, even a statement that could be made. Beaumont is a very violent prison. It's a very hard place. And in this particular instance, I had just come out of a trip to the hole. And it was in the hole that a lot of things began to reposition themselves in my life. And going forward from there, I said, you know what? I want to do something a little different. And as I was reading through the text, I came upon Numbers, and I came upon Numbers chapter 6 that Joan so eloquently read for us. And I said, you know what? I think this is something I want to do. And so I had a little part in my cell, a little corner where I would pray. And I went down there and got on my knees and I said, hey, Lord, I'm going to do this. And I'm going to need your help because this is something that's a very long task. It seems to be like it can be a very difficult task at times, like can't get McDonald's. And it's something, they call having long hair back then, they said that it brought shame upon you. And in today's age, things are a little different with long hair. It's pretty readily accepted no matter where you go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the last 6 years were like and just take you into that place where I was and let you come to your own conclusion about things. I'd like to thank Judd and Martha, where is she? There she is, for opening up y'all's home to us tonight. Thank you. And for providing for the food and refreshments. And, excuse me, those who came from out of town as well, Jim and Diane. I'd like to thank Wanda for coming. Thank you. Judy and John. There y'all are. Mom, Bob and Susan. Bobby, I haven't seen you in forever, so I'm glad you made it out here. Who did I miss? Roman and Stephanie. I'm glad y'all could come. It's good to see y'all. So does God speak to us? I imagine this question would be answered in many different ways as there are attendees in this room. Perhaps everything from a straightforward yes to a matter-of-fact no. And in between, responses might range from, well, he gives signs, or he whispers like he did to Elijah, or he comes in a whirlwind like he did for Job. And though I pose this question, I'm not going to give you a direct answer. Indeed, any attempt to do so would rob the question of its power, which is a very Jewish notion in and of itself. And because this is a Jewish rite, what better way to celebrate it than to not answer your question? Instead, I would like to share with you my own path and let you come to your own conclusion thereof. As most of you know, I was convicted of aggravated bank robbery, a crime I did in fact commit. Indeed, on July 8th, 2013, I entered into Citibank in a two-piece Joseph A. Banks charcoal gray suit and proceeded to display the handle of a realistic BB gun to the teller. She promptly handed over the proceeds, which I passed along to a friend. I put this right here. It says, why rob a bank? So this was testimony that was in my pre-sentence report, which is compiled by the federal government before you're sentenced, and so the judge can review it. And so the person to whom I'd given the money, she actually wrote a letter to the judge himself and explained about the situation. Now, to her credit, she didn't know that I robbed a bank. She didn't know where the money came from, but I didn't tell her that I had robbed a bank, despite the fact that she continually pressed me. Unfortunately, when I was apprehended, they thought that I lived at her house. And so the FBI went to her house and completely destroyed the place. I was apprehended the day following the bank robbery, submitted to federal court where in 4.5 months, I was charged, indicted, convicted, and sentenced to prison. This judge ran what they called a rocket docket, and he was known as Maximum Sentence Sam. When I entered prison, I had faith smaller than a mustard seed. In fact, it might be appropriate to say I had no faith, but that wasn't entirely accurate. I had faith, just not in the Lord God of my upbringing. I waged war against that God. I cursed his name. I spat on the ground at the very mention thereof. I hated the church, and I took aim at what I then believed to be a very easy and very deserving target. Simply, it didn't make any sense to me. It was foolishness. It confused me, and it downright pissed me off. Instead, I chose to pursue Buddhism. I accustomed myself to deep meditation and could spend hours in the half lotus, touching the nothingness, as my friend Shine liked to say. In fact, on one occasion when I was in my cell, I fainted while doing deep breathing, and I struck my head against the side of my cell, causing my eye to turn black. The next day when I was going to lunch, the warden saw it and he said, "Come here, what happened to your eye?" I said, "Well, warden, I was meditating and I passed out and I hit the side of my cell." No more questions, he let me go. What I've learned is that when you give them an answer that they never heard before, they're much more likely to not ask you anything further and to simply let you go. Though Buddhism served a purpose in quieting my mind, it ultimately proved a lonely pursuit. I abandoned the practice in 2017, instead relegating myself to the age-old practice of hating the church and scoffing at the notion of God. It's fitting that 2018 became the most difficult and most violent of my incarceration. It was the year I was transferred to FCI Beaumont Medium, or more accurately, FCI Bloody Beaumont, as it is well known. This was a photograph taken with my dad and me in May of 2018 after I'd been there for about 4 months. There came moments of intense violence, and there were actually occasions there that I feared for my life. For example, in August of that year, I accepted a cellmate whom I later had to kick out of my cell. This naturally did not go well, and hours after I informed him he would no longer be living there, he returned in a state of agitation. He entered in during my lunch break, begged for another chance, which of course I could not give to him. He then cornered me in the cell and started swinging. He screamed unjust words and accused me and my ancestors of stealing his land. There was no use in rationalize with him, and I instead tried to talk him down. This had the opposite effect, and soon I was being wailed upon by blows from a man who was nearly double my size. He became frustrated because he couldn't get as close to me as he liked, and when he swung down on the last time, he cut his hand, and he proceeded to throw blood on me. He ran out of the cell. Now, being in fear of my life at this point from this guy, I had to respond. I lived in a place where if you didn't respond, you would open yourself up to become a target for other people. To let that go would only subject me to a wider array of the same. After the afternoon count, as soon as the doors were unlocked, I ran out my cell, down the stairs, right up to him, and punched him in the face as hard as I could. To my surprise, he fell over. I went down on the ground and wrapped my legs around his neck and started squeezing as hard as I could, trying to invoke what the Marines taught me to use. This was not something that they like you to do in prison, the inmates that is. They call it an unfair fight. So they made me disengage. They took us off into a side room where we fought it out. And I lost that fight. I left that room with 2 black eyes and a bloody face. But I had commanded the respect of the men around me. They said, "Hey, you know what? You may have lost, but you stood up for yourself." And a lot of times in prison and also in life, it's not so much whether you win the fight, it's whether you stand up for yourself. This prisoner despised me for this. He was so angry that I would receive a hero's welcome for losing the fight. His ostracization intensified, and he was already now not well regarded. I would start to catch him staring at me over the time to come. Now, he had been locked up over 20 years. He had been in an even more violent prison for that entire time. And I knew that he was trying to concoct a scheme to get me. But an opportunity, even as much as I tried to dodge him, would eventually arise. To whom could I go for help? Not the officers, not the inmates. Couldn't go to anybody on the outside. Sure as heck didn't go to God. And if he did exist, that is God. I hated him. I was more afraid during this time than I'd ever been in my entire life. That photo was taken right in the midst of all this. You remember that visit? That was a hard visit. Then suddenly, and without warning, I was told I was going to be transferred to another prison. This brought relief, but I still harbored fear because he still had another 24 hours to get me. Fortunately, as incidents happen at this prison all the time, we were locked down soon after for something else somebody did, and I got to spend those last 24 hours locked in my cell. One of the few times when I was glad to be locked inside my cell. When I arrived at Beaumont Low, I met a much more relaxed place, though it was still harsh and still very violent. I was approaching my 63rd month of continual incarceration, but still had much more to go than that. I should take a moment here now to speak of the number 63. When I was in pretrial before I was sentenced, my attorney prepared me to receive a 63-month sentence. I became somewhat obsessed with the number and started looking for it everywhere, trying to find some way to corroborate what my attorney was telling me. Naturally, this failed to materialize in any way whatsoever, as I was instead sentenced on December 5th, 2013 to those 188 months. Now, in the federal system, you have to serve 87.6% of your time, and there is no parole. So that meant on that sentence, I would serve 13 years and 8 months before I would be allowed to be released. And that was in the best case scenario, provided that I didn't get in any kind of trouble, which we'll get into a little bit more later. My love of the number 63, however, persisted, notwithstanding that bad twist of fate in the courthouse. On October 9th, 2019, 63 months to the day, I met a man whom I quickly befriended and who, over the next year, would convince me to redirect my path towards and not away from God. You see, Rich was a Christian, but not in such a way I'd ever witnessed in another. And that's not to denigrate the faith of anybody at all. Rich walked his faith in a manner that made sense to me. He spoke boldly, but not inappropriately. He studied quietly and shared freely. He emphasized the objective standard set forth by Christ, and no matter to whom he spoke, he harbored no embarrassment or shame. He explained and lived out the importance of belonging to a regular group of worshipers. In a place where men regularly demean their wives and family, I never heard him once do so. He liked to say, "You don't want to be seen in town in a Honda when you've got a Ferrari back in the garage." I later learned that Rich had actually been famous and had his own television show and firearms company. It even more surprised me how devoted he was to Christ, because he had had the opportunity to be enticed by so many pleasures of the world. Yet he never attempted to dissuade me of my criticism of God. After 6 months of friendship, I wanted what he had. Our daily discussions pivoted more towards God, towards Jesus, and how there is a way to live in the dedication thereof without being, for lack of a better word, a weirdo. In April 2019, while working a crossword puzzle, I came to clue 63, which simply read, wish. Now, my mind is saying, hey, maybe there's something here, but the other part of me is saying, no, you're crazy, this doesn't mean anything. But I capped my pen and I sat back and I thought, what do I want? What do I want more than anything in the world? Freedom? Money? No. I put that down and I said, I wish I wasn't a drug addict anymore. There was a little expectation that such a fanciful notion would ever come to fruition. However, I had no idea of the way my life would be shaped from that point going forward. It wasn't any immediate change. Instead, there came an endless series of events and decisions that took me away from the drugs that had so wrecked everything in my life. I actually continued using at this time, but it wasn't the same. In October 2019, Rich was suddenly informed that his appeal had been successful and he was going back to court, we hoped, to be released. In his absence, I wrote a pardon application for him, and that became my first lengthy literary work, which I entitled Bewitched. On December 8th, 2019, I returned to my cell following lunch and opted to nap. As soon as I laid down, a strong notion, perhaps even a voice, took over and said, go to church. I actually argued therewith, saying I was tired. I didn't want to go. That I was not going. Period. Unrelenting, the voice continued to beckon me until ultimately I said, fine, I'll go. And I got up. I barely made it out before the door was locked, and I made my way to the non-denominational Christian service that they held there every Sunday. As Christmas was near, we sang familiar hymns and listened to a guest preacher speak about something that I can't remember. When he got near the end, he delved into the benediction and made the familiar altar call, something I had heard, disregarded hundreds if not thousands of times. Yet inside, that voice again arose. Go up there. No, I'm not going. Go up there. No, I'm not going. Go up there. And on and on and on it went. And the more that I tried to stifle it, the stronger it became. And not only a voice in my mind, but it began as a physical manifestation. I could feel heat inside. I could feel burning. I could feel prickly. I could feel fire. And it kept building and it kept building. And finally I jumped up and I said, I want to know Jesus. And he looked at me and every head turned toward me. And I thought, oh no, I didn't say what I thought I just said. And he said, what? I said, I want to know Jesus. He said, come up here. I went up there. The guys laid their hands upon me. And I left that place where it felt like something had given way inside my heart. But nothing changed, or so it seemed. I continued my normal routine, continued doing wasteful living and drug abuse. I performed some legal work, but nothing of substance. On January 6, 2020, I was the last one to walk to dinner. As I was walking, I looked up to the sky and I said, God, when is all of this going to begin? When are things going to change? And it was my surprise when I got an immediate answer that time. When you get sober, I went into the chow hall and I ate, playing this over in my head. Did I really hear something? Maybe that's the kind of argument we all have with ourselves when we think something extraordinary has happened. I was walking back from dinner. I said, okay, God, I'm going to test you. I'm ready to get sober. 45 seconds later, as I entered back into my cell block, a lieutenant, a very mean lieutenant, was already in my cell and she was mutilating all my things. 30 seconds later, she was screaming my name, in which I appeared before, and said, that's me. She said, do you have anything you're not supposed to have? Of course, every inmate has stuff they're not supposed to have. And I knew it was a loaded question, so I lied to her. No. She said, I'm locking you up. They put me in the hole where I got sober. When I arrived there, I was stripped naked like a newborn, marched through the threshold into my cell, and a shirt, a pair of shorts, and a pair of socks was thrown at me through the bean slot, which is this little hole in the door that they slide things through. Your meal, because you don't ever leave the cell. You stay in there all day, every day. Not only was it January, but in every federal facility I've ever been to, the air conditioner was on full blast. It was absolutely freezing in there. That's one of the worst parts about going to the hole, is how cold they keep it back there. I was told to shut up and sit down, which I did. I soon prayed again and I said, hey Lord, I'm back here with nothing. Would you send me your word? 3 days later, my new cellmate arrived. And in a place where books are tightly controlled, every prisoner is allowed to have just one legal text. He happened to have 2 Bibles, and he gave me one. I opened it, I began reading, and the words were seemingly arranged in a different way because it made sense to me. It had never made sense to me before. And as I started reading through it, I said, has this been in here the whole time? I couldn't get enough of it, and I embarked on a journey that would take me through every word of that Bible many times over. When I eventually came to the part in the Gospels where it said Jesus opened the mind of the disciples to the Scriptures, I said, okay, this makes sense right here. I understood and I realized that this was actually something genuine. Even nearly 6 years later, I continued to read that book every single day, never getting enough and never being satisfied. Several weeks into my then indeterminate shoe stay came the weekly laundry exchange. This consisted of the officer opening that bean slot in the door, yelling at me to throw my clothes out into the hallway, and then he gives me a set of fresh clothes. Doesn't matter if they fit, doesn't matter if they're clean, this is what you're getting. What I felt inside was this crinkle. And I said, what on earth is this? And I opened the shirt, and inside were 4 pages of the King James Version. In fact, these pages were from the Gospel of Luke, from chapter 8, verse 40, all the way through chapter 10, 31. 2 consecutive pages, front and back. I've read over those many, many times trying to figure out what they meant. When we get to the end here, I have something to show you about these right here. So whilst I was still in there one Sunday afternoon, I heard that same voice tell me, hey, turn on your radio, flip over to 88.1. So I turned on the radio, and it had classical music playing. It said, just stay here until this finishes. I waited and waited and waited. And during that time, something in that voice was telling me to say something to the guy in my cell. Now, the guy in my cell was a friend of mine. I'd known him for several years, but he was much bigger than me, and he was a lot stronger than me. At this point, I was still wrecked by back pain, and this guy worked out every single day. He was very fit. And this voice is telling me to share something with this guy that I did not want to say. And I sat there listening to that music, going back and forth again, just like it was in church. No, I'm not going to say that. No. You're going to say this. No, I'm not going to say that. Starting to think that, okay, I'm a nut. I'm losing my mind. I'm back here in the hole. Sensory deprivation. I finally lost my mind. It's finally given way here at this point. That the Lord was exceptionally angry with him for buying his freedom with the life of another person. Like that day in church, I ascribed craziness to myself. When the symphony ended about 45 minutes later, I sat up, climbed down from the top bunk, sat on the commode because there are no chairs back there. And I said, I need to tell you something. He looked over at me, and I told him exactly what I said the Lord had told me to say to him. I immediately knew it was true. His eyes went wide. He backed up all the way into the wall, didn't know what he was doing, triggered the distress button. He couldn't speak, and I thought he was going to have a fit. He wasn't angry. He was scared. He didn't know what to say, and I didn't know what to say either. I simply said, hey, you know what? That's none of my business. It's between you and the Lord. Got back up into the bunk and was thinking to myself, you know what? There's a song I really like by the band called The Afters called Well Done. If I turned on my radio, that'd be cool if that song was on. Turned on the radio, the song wasn't on. In fact, it was just dead quiet, and then the song began 2 seconds later. While I was in the shoe, I was visited by the Lord, so to speak. Now you say, oh, the physical manifestation of Jesus came to you? No. And I was directed to found a law clinic when I got out. Before I entertained this idea, though, any further, I was challenging the Lord. I was like, hey, this is crazy. Show me something. If this is what you want me to do, show me something. So grab your Bible. Grab my Bible. So close your eyes. Open it. Put your finger down. Now look. And when I looked down there, my finger was in Isaiah, and on top of the verse that said, for the Lord has redeemed Jacob. This couldn't be. Things like this don't happen. So I knew some law at this point, and I could assemble some basic petitions, but I believed I was ill-prepared to ever create a service that offered a wide variety of legal help. I felt excitement over the prospect, and upon my release, true to his command, I founded the advocacy service that I operate today, Inmate Legal. This was our original logo right here. Now, we don't have computers in there, so I had to create it by hand. And what I did is I drew it really big, and then I got one of the clerks to shrink it down with a copy machine so it would give it some cleaner edges. But once I got out, I was able to remake the logo and to make it for today's age. I think it looks a lot better that way. So whenever I would do a brief for somebody in prison, they have to file it pro se, which means they file it in their own name. I would always include my logo, though, on the last page. And the reason why is because then I could get credit for being the one who wrote these briefs. About 76 days into my internment in the shoe, they came by and said, hey, Powell, do you want to go back to the yard? This meant I was going to be released. Now, I didn't think this was going to happen because they already told me I was going back to the medium, back to that hard, crazy, unrelenting prison. So be it, that's what it was going to be. But other things were in store. COVID had hit, and they needed the space back there. And so the warden said, I'm going to let you back out. Thank goodness. When I arrived to my cell block, there was much surprise. It had been rumored that I had already been shipped back to the medium. And in prison, rumors are accepted as fact. Returning to general population following time in the hole amounted to sensory overload. And I spent the first week in a daze. The very first day, though, I noticed that there was a King James version of a Schofield Reference Bible sitting on top of the mailbox that was made in 1945. I had no idea how it got inside the prison. I told myself, hey, if that's there the next day, I'm going to grab it. Don't know why I didn't grab it then. Went along the day, came back the next day, and it was still there. I said, I read that King James scripture when I was in the hole that came to me in that shirt. And I was like, it's very beautiful. It was written so eloquently. I wish they wrote like that today. So I picked it up. I studied it. The ribbon marker was placed in the middle already, and it had a knot on it. And it was sitting on this verse right here. For the Lord hath chosen Jacob unto himself. So I'm thinking to myself, somebody set this up. Somebody put this here. This is a joke. But nobody knew I was coming back. And in fact, they thought I was already long gone. It was unbelievable. And it was just more of that assurance along the path saying, okay, you're on the right path. Keep going this way. I continued the walk I had begun and dedicated time to read the Word every day. My friend Adrian always ensured that I have a copy of The Word Among Us. The Word Among Us is something that an organization prints, and it gives you the daily Catholic readings in there, which if you read it every day for 3 years, you read through the whole Bible. It also has a little homily in there, so a way of trying to derive some meaning from the text. I treasured these daily readings, a practice that I continue on to this day. In fact, I've even got the app now for it, and it reads it to me in the morning. That's awesome. Earlier, I spoke of having been visited by the Lord in the hole. Indeed, as I told you earlier, this was not a physical manifestation. Following my return to general population, I began earnestly asking the Lord, hey, I want to see you. I want you to appear before me in a physical body some way. Kind of like the way I read in the Bible. I want this to happen. I prayed, I asked, I begged, and I yearned for this. I wouldn't stop. One day soon after this guy Ramirez comes up to me and he says, hey, there's an inmate in here who needs some legal help. I said, lead the way. So he leads me around and we enter into the cell of this guy. And I walk up to him and I say, how do you do? I'm Jacob Powell. And I hold my hand out. Well, they're laughing behind me. And I said, what's so funny? They said, he's blind. I said, oh, okay. So I find his hand and shake it. He says, how do you do? My name is Jesus. So in my asking the Lord to see him, he sends me to a blind man named Jesus. Now, I think the Lord has a really good sense of humor about that. So shortly after my release from the SHU, while reading that old black Bible I had stumbled upon, I likewise stumbled upon the chapter in Numbers, the Nazarite Vow, or as Jones read for us, the order of the host, the Nazarite. The Nazarite being a person who separates themselves, who decides to undertake certain limitations and restrictions on their life, and in doing so, it says he has the consecration of the Lord upon his head. What all that means is that you've just kind of saying, hey, for the time being, I'm going to put myself over here to say I want to dedicate some time and some effort and some energy to understand the Lord and to understand him a little bit better. As there's no specified time limit, I decided to say, hey, 63 months. And when I took it, I didn't know that it was going to end on my 40th birthday, which is today. Inmate legal was still in its infant stages, but I was dedicated to expanding its reach. In mid-2020, a fellow prisoner named Daryl Edmund Janice, this gentleman right here, approached me for help. After reviewing his file and studying his free-world medical records, I discovered that he had died from another type of coronavirus back in 2015, the strain NL63. I took that information and we sent it to his federal judge, who decided to let this guy go early. In fact, in a place where you have to serve 87.6% of your time, Mr. Janice only had to serve a little under 50. The fact of his release quickly spread through the inmate population, and soon I was inundated with requests for help, more than I could ever handle. My father was very generous in providing me the financial means to offer help. Now, there were cases like with Mr. Janice where he didn't have any money at all. He's a Native American from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is the poorest Indian reservation in the entire country. It's also not far from Mount Rushmore. One early morning in October 2020, immediately following my daily exercise, I returned to my cell to grab my shower gear. While I was in, what did I hear? That same crazy voice again. It said, "Hey, psst, over here." I looked over to my left and I saw a word among us for the next month, one that I hadn't looked at, sticking up. I said, okay. I reached for it, and as I reached for it, it said 63. I opened to page 63, and that's what it said. Hearing God speak. I said, okay, I must still be on the right path here, because this seems to be a little sign of encouragement to help things keep going. Today is the first time that I've ever spoken publicly about any of this, because I go back and forth in my own head. I think I'm just nuts, crazy, and if I tell people, they're going to try to put me in a straitjacket and they're going to lock me up. Well, please don't do that, at least not tonight on my birthday. My next release came in August 2022. This gentleman right here, Tony Baker. He was freed 16 years early. He had been 18 when he committed his crimes, a string of robberies, and he was the driver. Because of mandatory minimum federal sentencing, he was sentenced to 540 months in prison, or 45 years. He would have been nearly 60 by the time he got out. Today, he enjoys his freedom. He has a life. He has a woman in his life. He has a good job. And he remains so grateful that he was able to get out of prison. Like Daryl, I absolutely love Tony. And I continue to reflect on his release, enjoying those moments with the Lord. That same year, I got into a routine of asking the Lord to show me who I was to him. I think that's something we might all want to know, but it's something that I became especially interested in at this time. I believe that we are all here to serve a purpose for the Lord. We're made that way. It tells us that he makes us, we're knitted together in the womb. And I believe that we're here each to do a certain task for him, or a set of tasks. I wanted to know mine. One afternoon, while standing in my locker, what did I hear? That same voice. It said, turn to page 763 of your Bible, which was the Schofield Reference Bible. So I took that and I turned to that page. And it was one of the minor prophets. And I thought, okay, how does this relate to what you're telling me? It was unusual because at that exact same time, I had my little music player on. And this one had songs that I put on there, and there were several hundred of it. But I was thinking about this, and as I was thinking about it, I stepped back, and my hand hit the advance button and changed the song to Who Am I by Les Mis. I looked down at my left hand, and my left hand was on top of this little book right here that I had gotten about 4 years before then, entitled Who Am I? Next came Derek Eugene Kurtman, whom I freed through a writ of habeas corpus. Then Lucas Manrajas, whose release was accompanied through just fighting the BOP and not having to go to court, the BOP being the Bureau of Prisons. At this point, the count stood at 4. And though I focus on these feats, the sole focus of Inmate Legal was not to get guys out of prison. It was to help guys with all the types of legal issues that they face in prison. Most of them have no money to hire an attorney, nor do they know what they're doing, and they go to an inmate who charges them an astronomical price, gives them a terrible product, angers their judge, and screws them out of any chance in the future of getting any kind of justice in that court. Very, very terrible deal for them. I like to think of John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, is that be right? And he said, do all the good I can, by all the means I can, in all the ways I can, to all the people I can, as long as ever I can. And those words became the mantra from Inmate Legal. Another mantra that we like to adopt was lawfully bringing the Bureau of Prisons to its knees. They became a little upset about that one, so we stopped putting that in there. So this went from dismissal of tickets to the reconciliation of overdue child support, to custody battles, to prison administrative remedies, and so forth. There were occasions when my active caseload would exceed over 30 cases at the same time. This was very difficult because I didn't have an office. I continually had to face staff retaliation. For example, one day during the count, they came running in there into my cell and they took my typewriter from me. This happened 5 times. They destroyed it. I remember I called home to Dad and I said, Dad, I don't know how I'm going to get this work done. Remember what you told me? Well, son, you got a hand and a pen. Get started writing. And I did. In fact, Tony's was one of the ones I had to hand write. Got him out of prison. It's wonderful. In September 2021, I decided it was time to put into words an agreement with the Lord. A contract, so to speak. On the 22nd day of September, I tore out a sheet from my journal and I wrote out a contract for services between me and God. Party number 1, God. Party number 2, Jacob Allen Powell. This is a contract of exchange for services rendered between, for, or around said parties. Date of execution is provided at the end of this contract. I, Jacob Allen Powell, do hereby attest to the following. I pledge my life to the Lord, our God, my sweet Elohim, for as long as I shall live. If required, I will give my life for the Lord. May the Lord remain nearby and available to clarify his wishes and commands, and may he give me courage, will, and style in doing so. May I be fervent for the Lord, so that it is clear whom I love is him. My resolve to him will remain firm, and may he encourage me at least once daily, or more, or less for good cause shown. I will be faithful unto giving to party 1, God, at least 10% of everything that he gives me. May I be wise into whom these resources go. And may I always be equipped for all needs brought before me. I will continue honing this gift with words and will use it as the Lord sees fit. May I also teach this gift and so much else unto others. May I retain my wit and intellect unto my death, ever growing in both. May he bless me accordingly to these words, and may he free me from drugs forever. I am yours, God. Do with me as you will. Signed, this 22nd day of September 2021, Jacob Allen Powell. So I make this contract out between me and God and say, okay, God, here we go. Put some blood. All right, it's sanctified now. On the 25th, which was then 63 months to the day before my release, so 3 days after I wrote this, something very unusual happened. During that time, a group of inmates in my cell block and I would meet every night and we would read one chapter out of the Bible. At that time, we happened to be reading Jeremiah. On that day, we happened to be on chapter 31. Now, when I had my Word Among Us meditation for that same day, it was the exact same part in Jeremiah. Now, what does that verse say right there? For the Lord hath redeemed Jacob and ransomed him from the hand that was stronger than he. I read this and I say, oh, you're talking about drugs. And indeed, from that point going forward, the drugs were no longer a part of my life. I calculated the odds that 2 unrelated groups that studied in the Bible would actually have the same verse on the same day. Now, if we were to say the same chapter on the same day, it's over 1 in a million. If we were to say the same verse on the same day, it's about 1 in 50 million. Add in the fact that the verse includes my name and talks about the very thing that I had just made a contract with God for 3 days before. The substance of that day's homily similarly invoked a mission for the Lord that aligned with the person whom God said I was. In fact, over here, he even said, as human beings, we need physical signs of his presence. How about that? In 2022, I was approached by John Russell Morales, who sought to be released early in order to care for his elderly mother. She was 91, she turned 92, and she had cancer, and she was going to pass away soon. I spoke to his doctors, I spoke to his family, and we got all the records together. And we sent it in. And this is the only case I've ever had where the U.S. attorney filed a motion in support of it. And they said, yeah, you can let this guy go. About a month after that, the court came down and said, hey, you're free to go. Number 5. In April 2022, I was in the library one day. And what did I hear? That same voice. Psst, over here. And I'm sitting at this table in the library, and there's nobody in there except the clerk way over there. And I said, okay, that's not him. That must be that same voice. And I look up, and about 30 feet from me is a book on the spine which read Wooden. It was about John Wooden, the basketball coach from UCLA who had 10 national championships. I go to reach for the book, and what does it say? 63. And what is on that page? My first and my last name are in the text. Couldn't believe it. Several days later, while awaiting to check out some books, I look down at the book cart, hear that same thing again, psst, right here. I look down and I see Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol. It says 63. Judd, father. Now, how is that going to happen? It was also around this time that I met Chris. And hold tight, we're almost done. An Irish Catholic from New York who spoke in a manner indicative of someone from Long Island. He learned of my journey and I of his, and he invited me to the Catholic service, which was held on Tuesdays. I hesitated because I said, no, the Catholic Church, that's a bunch of whack jobs. I don't want to go over there. Nevertheless, I went, and I discovered a manner of worship which was seemingly tailor-made for me. I fell in love, and through his and Adrian's encouragement, began the process of confirmation. Deacon Ricky and Sister Misty conducted the services, and they were there for us every single Tuesday. After several years of the COVID lockdowns, they hadn't let any visitors in. And so Sister Misty came up there about 2.5 years after the COVID outbreak, and she's like, hey, we need to get these services going. This is her talking to the administration. Now, this is a prison, one run by the federal government, and the federal government does not be told what to do of anybody, especially the church. She sat down and she refused to leave. She said, I'm not leaving until you let me in there. So they scrambled, they made calls, they're saying, what are we going to do? Are we going to arrest a nun? And she won. They let her in. And she restarted our services in there, and she got it going. And because it got restarted, I was able to go with Chris and get introduced to the church. God bless them. Those two servants taught me about love, commitment, and dedication. My faith grew finally into that mustard seed, culminating with my confirmation and proceeding to this day, the conclusion of the vow. I've come to love the church, and when I was released, I took every step necessary to regularly attend Mass. I stayed in contact with Chris, who was released about a year before me, and he was a mentor through which I have been able to fortify my faith. One day, he sent me a link in a text message and said, hey, check out this guy. I opened it up, and it happens to be the deacon at this church who's in charge of the prison ministry. And he says, hey, why don't you go introduce yourself to this guy, huh? Get to know him. I said, I don't know, Chris. A few weeks after that, while leaving Mass, this woman, whom I don't know, comes up to me. She says some very kind words to me, gives me a hug, and she tells me, I am Deacon Gary's wife. Now, I didn't know these people, but Deacon Gary was the same guy Chris was telling me to go meet. I still don't initiate the contact with Deacon Gary. Who do I see in IHOP 3 weeks ago? Them. And then when I get up, I see him and I realize, oh, this is her. Still don't make contact. See them again the next week. So I'm not living up to that particular end right there and saying, hey, maybe I should get in touch with this guy. They were invited tonight, but I think plans came up, so I guess they weren't able to make it. Now, I just want to say I'm touched, very much so, that all of you came tonight. I love you all. Very grateful for y'all. saw some really bad families when I was in prison. I'm so thankful that I don't have to come out to that. I never knew what I had until it was taken away from me. And realizing that, oh, this is really good. Good friends, family. So to close, I'm going to redirect our focus back to these. Remember the 4 pages that were found in the shirt? Well, today happens to be the feast of the transfiguration of Jesus. And which verse do they use? Out of chapter 9, the transfiguration. That was what the Lord had given me then, right when my vow started. And it just so happens to be the Catholic scripture on the day that my vow ends. So to close, I'd like to redirect our focus here. And I ask you again, does the Lord speak? Now, please no applause. Everybody will get up. We're going to make our way to the gazebo. And Roman is going to shave my head. Well, Jones, you tell us what happens.
And this is the law of the Nazarite vow. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he shall be brought unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and he shall offer his offering unto the Lord. 1 he-lamb of the first year without blemish for a burnt offering, and 1 ewe-lamb of the first year without blemish for a sin offering, and 1 ram without blemish for a peace offering. In a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of fine flour mingled with oil, and wafers of unleavened bread anointed with oil, and their meat offering and their drink offerings. And the priest shall bring them before the Lord, and shall offer his sin offering and his burnt offerings, and he shall offer the ram for a sacrifice of peace offerings unto the Lord. With the basket of unleavened bread, the priest shall offer also his meat offering and his drink offering. And the Nazarite shall shave his head of his separation at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and shall take the hair of his head of his separation, and put it in the fire which is under the sacrifice of the peace offerings.
look good, dude. You look real good.
Awesome. So when you get to the end of the chapter, here's how we're going to do this. Everybody just hold your hand out in front of you. Repeat after me. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Sorry, y'all are downwind.